1,000 years, the British people have been hitting, beating and killing each other in all sorts of nasty ways. From the cradle to the grave, violence has been a fact of life for us lovely, civilised British. But why did violence play such a big part in the everyday lives of our ancestors? How did it shape the society in which they lived? Yeah, but before we get all high and mighty about this, what about us? Would we, us 21st centuryists, be as violent as our ancestors if we didn't have laws to stop us?
For most of our history, Britain has pretty much been a free-for-all, based on wealth and might, and laws were passed to benefit the powerful. Ordinary folk were expected to know their place and stay there.
Shut up.
The chief instrument for keeping everyone in their place was violence, and no one was exempt. Men, women, or children.
Let's talk about violence against men. Today, in Britain, your average man has only got a 1 in 20 chance of being a victim of violent crime. But things were very different in Tudor times. Travel back to the 15th or 16th centuries, and you're 5 times more likely to die a violent death than today. And you had a strong chance of getting a good kicking from your local lord, or being flogged senseless by your employer. And ordinary Tudor men would more than likely get into a fight with each other within minutes of leaving their front doors. Why was that? The Tudors had a very complicated system of being violent to each other, and it was all to do with status. Let me tell you a real story. This actually happened.
In 1523, the Viscount of Kells, a man of very high status, known personally to the king, was driving along the King's Highway when all of a sudden, you won't believe this, there was a common peasant, a rustic type, in his way.
So the Viscount got out of his carriage and he went up to the bloke and gave him a bloody good severe beating with his cane until the frightful little inbred country type came around to his point of view about whose right of way it was. And after giving him the beating he so richly deserved, the man died. This was a bit awkward. Even in those days, you couldn't just wander around killing people. And the Viscount was brought before the House of Lords under a charge of murder. Not a problem for our Viscount, though. He told the king that it wasn't his fault. He was merely retaliating to the fact that a peasant had got in his way and wouldn't get out of his way. Well, the king was shocked. This was, and I quote, a frightful affront. It was very, very great provocation and downright insolence. So the king pardoned him, and quite right too.
But violence wasn't confined to the landed gentry. It ran through the whole of male society.
Violence was woven into daily interactions. It was a very important part of upholding hierarchies and confirming status in the early modern period. There are some forms of violence, like, say, slapping someone on the face, that if a master did to his servant, wouldn't be considered violence. But if the servant did that to his master, that would be really very shocking.
Right.
Hierarchy was incredibly important, and this is a society where there's no police force. You're relying on amateurs in roles of constable and so on at the local level, and the way that order is maintained is through associating authority with status, with everybody knowing their place and staying in that place.
It's a kind of society's language. It doesn't matter what class you are. Everybody understands this language and they behave by its rules.
Yeah.
The Tudors lived in an extremely violent time in British history, and they used violence to maintain the pecking order of the day. Rich men would beat up poor men, titled men would beat up commoners, older men would beat up younger men. But what if you're a man at the very bottom of the pile? Who did you get to pick on? The only place where you were lord and master was in your own home. And after a hard day waiting on his lordship at the castle and being beaten with a stick, the one compensation you had was to knock the living daylights out of your wife.
British society's attitudes towards women are constantly changing. In the past, violence towards women wasn't just approved, it was even endorsed. Did you know the Romans were actually allowed to kill their wives just for drinking alcohol? And the Anglo-Saxons used to cut off their wives' noses and ears for committing adultery. And the 6th century Christian church told women that getting a thrashing from their man was actually good for them, because a woman's ability to endure violence was a sign of a virtuous wife and a good Christian. So all you had to do was to get beaten up by your husband, not complain about it, and you could go to heaven.
Women didn't get much better treatment from the state either. When Henry II came to power in 1154, he created for the first time ever a formal legal system for Britain.
The common law was written for the people, stating that legally a man's wife was his possession. Men had the right to beat their wives, so long as they did it what was called moderately and reasonably, which actually meant that basically you could do anything you wanted to her, as long as you didn't murder her. That was a crime.
And if a woman complained about this state of affairs, she didn't get very far.
In 1396, in York, a poor woman called Margaret Neffield decided to attempt the rare and brave step of dissolving her marriage on the grounds of cruelty. And although her husband Thomas did admit that, yes, he had beaten her up, rather a lot, and yes, he had broken her arm, and yes, he had slashed her around a bit, well, a lot, with a knife and things, but the court decided that no, Margaret did not have a case. She didn't have a case. And not only that, the court advised Thomas to beat her up even more, to correct her faults.
When women complained about violence, they got no protection from the law. And medieval man had some very clever devices and contraptions up his sleeve to keep a woman in her place.